Welcome back, everyone. Here for another research chat. Today I've got a good friend and colleague, Cathy van Ingen from Brock University. I was just about to say Toronto, but lived and we met in Toronto, but at Brock University. We're going to talk a little bit today about Cathy's work in boxing, specifically within an anti-violence campaign, not an anti-violence campaign. No, I won't say much more because you can explain it better. But Cathy's work within boxing. Three things that kind of set this up really, and these are the things that set up my motivations to do these videos. It's a bit of a context for everyone. One is I like to talk about these types of research projects that I've talked about in the previous videos. I think they're great for my students to listen to. The other one is that, as people have seen, I learn a lot while I do this as well. And today that's the kind of main focus for today's session, because this idea for the chat came about by an email I sent to Cathy to help me basically. So I'll ask those questions again. And the third one is just the ability to get some of the information about other people's projects out in a way which I think is a bit more accessible than the kind of research methods that we are able to write in papers and books. So first off then, Cathy, hi. Can you just introduce yourself? Tell us about your research, where you're from, and a bit about how you came into boxing research as well, if possible.
Absolutely, yeah. And looking forward to having this conversation with you, Chris. So my research that I do is really on trauma, and using boxing as a way to engage people's bodies that are often left out of working through and getting past the trauma they've encountered. So really it's a project that works with women primarily, and now I'm working with youth who have experienced violence, domestic violence, structural violence. We've got people who have migrated from other places and encountered violence in their homes there. And what we know is that people, and particularly women, have opportunities to do talk therapy or they're often medicated to deal with symptoms they're experiencing from experiencing their violence, but their bodies are left out of that. So that's kind of the main sort of basis behind Shape Your Life. But how I got to Shape Your Life was really in part, which is a weird academic thing to say, but I kind of read my way into it. I was reading a lot of boxing histories, and was fascinated with those histories, and going back to Jack Johnson and Joe Louis, and the way race framed those interactions, and as I was reading those, there was an absence of women entirely. And so, and I thought, that can't be right. Why are there no histories in having those conversations? And so I really started to look at missing bodies, and went back to some women in the 1970s that were boxing in North America. And then I also thought, God, there's these, racialized women were doing incredibly hard labor, physical work, going back to the Victorian era where white women's femininity was really protected, but Black women were doing this other kind of labor, and other working class women. And so I dug into that and found, in fact, there were Black women boxing in the 1800s. And though less were kind of climbing through the ropes to do that, they were there, which made me kind of question why, in our telling of boxing, why we're only telling certain stories. And it just sort of opened up to me then, wanting to think about boxing differently. And then I moved into some boxing, and once I had that experience, it really reframed everything for me. Just seeing what it was like to train, to fight, to have that experience in the gym, and to move your body in that kind of way, and just take your body that seriously in training, which was different than varsity sport and other stuff I'd done. Because it's, as they say, you don't play boxing. And I played all the other sports, and that was remarkable for me. And so to want to use that experiences that I'd had to frame, to be able to bring that to other people who may not otherwise ever step into a boxing gym. And then to see how that, the question was really open, like what impacts would there be? And we started 1 year. We had funding for 1 year, and we thought just going to do a 1 year boxing project. And as soon as we started doing that work, we knew there was something really rich there. And we're now in our 14th year, had over 2,000 women come through the program. Now we're working with youth, and our understanding of what trauma and how to work with, and coach and do this non-contact boxing for people who have survived violence, and then doing research alongside that.
Yeah, so the way in which I was drawn back to your paper, Spatialities paper, which I'll put a link to, 2013, I think.
Yeah.
So that'll be linked below. I'm working on this book and it's gone really well, but a lot of the work has gone back to Bloomer and a few other very early symbolic interactionists talking about research. Very much of their time focused on debates within social science and hard sciences between objectivity and subjectivity and all the rest of it. And I came to this point where I was repeatedly saying something on the lines of, going into research with assumptions is bad. You know, it's bad science was some of the language I was using.
Right.
And it dawned on me that because I'd gone back to these kind of early bits of work and I hadn't updated them, all the ideas that I've been working with quite confidently for the last few years had slipped away. So I went back to your paper because I knew you went into that work with a specific idea about something that you wanted to happen. Now, notice I'm not saying there what you wanted to find, but what you wanted to happen. And I didn't have a space for that in this book that I am writing. So I had to reorganize my thoughts a little bit, and I had to go back to that thinking that I've been, like I say, been quite comfortable with. And that was where that email came from. Me just going, oh shoot, I need to speak to you about this because I've let this slip. So I guess the first way into that then is to say, how can we go into a research project to go and do science when we're going in with ideas about what we're going to find important at the start point? How do we manage that? How do we kind of navigate that?
Right. It's been interesting because doing this work, my research has always been really openly ideological, right? Like I'm going in hoping for some sort of transformation, going in to make an intervention. And that's a different way to approach your research because we've all been taught that, real data valid data is not, is neutral.
Yeah.
Right. And the kind of feminist scholarship that I come from just really debunks that. It says there's no such thing as data sets that are value neutral, right? They're already sort of critical, ethical, meaningful choices and the tools and techniques even are collecting that data are infused with choices and with values. And my first experience as a grad student, actually, it was just this sense of contradiction. I was taking two classes. One was in gender studies. I think it was called women's studies at the time. And it was on women's health. And I was taking one in the health and physical education department. And that one, the leading causes of death of women were like cancer, seatbelt usage, automobile accidents. And that same question in the gender course was really around violence and the impact of violence on women, particularly around certain ages. And I thought, how can this other course not even include that as an impact on women's health? And in this other course, it's saying this is the leading concern for women's health. And it's because Health Canada didn't include that data in the 90s, up until the mid 90s. So again, it was absent. This absence kind of is this ghost that haunts my research. And then what we're never taught is that all data sets are objects that are created for an audience, right? And you'll hear particularly scholars that work with numerical data rather than word-based data. They'll talk about the raw data. And I've come to learn that there's no such thing as raw data, right? It is someone collected the data. There was assumptions already built into that data set. And every bit of research is biased by definition. But we tend to only call out certain kinds of research as needing to sort of take care of that. And so I think all scientists should take a philosophy of research course. And unfortunately, it seems only certain kinds of scholars do. So I think that's something that our field needs to sort of address a little bit more. So if you're doing work that's really ideological, and I just want to step back a second too. It came from this notion, this really sort of classic feminist adage that, the personal is political and the political is personal. And then you start reading certain scholarship and you realize the personal is theoretical too, right? And at Sarah Ahmed, it says something like, the closer theory gets to her skin kind of thing, the more sense that makes. And the kind of work that we do, that's really embodied research that is located through questions that arise from one's body, fleshy, this body, then to think about the personal is political and the political is personal through that, then approaching research that is really around praxis and ideological it sits better with me than trying to hide that. Yeah. There are challenges with that because we're supposed to come with this interpretive authority, right? And so we tend to really clean data and tidy up our data sets, and present, in our research articles, we present these really kind of sanitized, we code, we reduce data. And so it's in these little bits, but there's way more complexities around that data. So the challenge is, how do you communicate that? How do you present data where you've laid out how you're approaching it, what your values are, what you're bringing to the research, what you're asking of the research. But how do you sort of complicate the stories that are, not complicate the stories that are already complicated, but how do you present that in a way that's meaningful and when it's being reduced to the page and where you don't have time to kind of contextualize everything. So that to me is the challenge of sort of presenting narratives that aren't completely tidy.
Yeah, especially when we have a word count, we have so many other things that we have to fit within that one representation. And I think, and we'll come on to this later as a second part of the questions that I was kind of interested in, it limits our ability to present the complexity of the research process and the difficulties that we had. And one of the things I said to you was, what about all the difficulties that we have? You just don't read them in methodologies. We do our bit. I did this many hours, I did that, and I was situated in these ways. But we tend to cover over some of the messiness of not even the messiness, the challenges that there are. And I think that's something that we'll talk about in terms of for young scholars to understand. But let's just keep with this kind of notion of, as you termed it, ideologically led research. So the critique then would be, here's my ideology, here's my data, I see my ideology in the paper. That the analogy is of if you're a hammer, everything's a nail. So and I don't think it's as simplistic as that, and I don't think what you're saying is as simplistic as that. So I guess as I turn to in the email, how do you make that still scientific, sciencey, as I might say to my students? Right. How do we able to go, okay, I'm going in with these assumptions, I'm going in with these ideas, and they are important. Clearly they're important, what you're talking about. But what if there's something more important that's happening there that is not suited to that ideology? Maybe it's a different way of understanding the world, which should come from that data, so that we can be faithful to the people's experiences that we're talking about. How do you manage that sort of critique?
The first part is you spend a lot of time in my writing sort of prefacing, positioning myself as a researcher, right? Locating myself in particular body of scholarship. And so that's locating myself in feminist work that looks at research as practice. And this notion, I use a lot of Patty Leva's work, who talks about not trying to tell the too easy to tell tale. Right. And I think, we don't ask these same questions to quantitative researchers, right? If I went in and did a pre and post and said, okay, look, their self-esteem improved by 20%, and we would all say, okay, right? But that's an incredibly tidy tale. But we never kind of critique that, right? What in the kind of work and the kind of really depth that this research allows you when you're doing body work, when you're spending a lot of time. When I interview people, I only interview them after a significant amount of time of working with them and being alongside them in the program. And so I usually sort of do this like a sequential interviewing where we've done a focus group, or I say focus group, and really what it is, I sit and ask them one question: what is boxing's effect on you? And then I kind of step back and let them talk. And then I offer up individual interviews if they want to kind of go deeper into some of what they said. And that lets us grasp a little bit more of their complexities of their lives. So what I mean by that is, boxing is a powerful thing in people's lives, right? It can be transformative. But again, that's a really tidy tale, right? So, we've got women in the program. So we had a woman, for example, and I think I wrote about it in the Spatiality article, who had turned her child over to child services because she'd experienced a lot of domestic violence. She was struggling financially. She didn't have the support she needed, and she thought the best thing for her child would be to turn her child to child services. And she came and she boxed with us, and in that she started to feel that she had something. She's powerful. She could do something, right? So she worked to get her child back, right? That's the tidy story. But in fact, it was way more complicated, and there was tons of supports needed to provide, that she needed, resources that most of us have access to that she didn't. And so we were able to kind of work and support her in getting those. So, the kind of way as a Black woman, she experienced even sort of services and shelter provisions when she was needing them was very different than another woman. So even in the telling of those stories, right, they get really reduced, in a way to get to the point we try to make. And so it's about how do you be accountable to the complexities of the research, and how do you also just acknowledge the limits, right?
Yeah.
So I think that's important, and I think that's it. And I think as scholars, like, we're finding new ways to do that. And I think the kind of way we want, we privilege journal articles, right, which are important ways to translate our work, but I'm always aware of who reads those and who doesn't read them, and could my participants even find themselves in that writing, right, when it's based on their experiences. So also, I'm kind of aware of that as a limitation in doing this work. But yeah, I really think moving away to sort of trying to abandon these really kind of simple tellings of our work, even though that's, I think, the model we're all told is science, yeah. Right? Like this really clean data, right? And if you do your methods properly, if you eat your, if you take your methodology class and you do this stuff, is a really kind of linear way to do your work. And, if you do field research, it's never like that.
No.
Right? It's way more complex, and there's richness in that. And, and I think that's why we have to, and it's not that you need to have you need to be able to demonstrate what your project's doing, what the data's telling you, right? But I think it's about not trying to focus on a really closed reading of it, but also being open to unexpected readings. And for me, that's where that anger article came from. I never thought I was going in to research or theorize anger, right? And it was really in that first year with the first group of women when we sat around and were talking, and the moment they had to speak to their experiences, they wanted to talk about what it was like for them to live with anger. And as women, they felt there were very few places that their anger could be accommodated. And a boxing gym is one place where that's like celebrated, right? Like you can bring your anger to a boxing gym and it's safe to do so. And then these women said, like, where in my world can I do this? Where can I, and then there was all this amazing work done by particularly BIPOC scholars saying, anger is an incredibly accurate response to injustice. And then it lets you get to that injustice, right? So talking about that anger then lets you lead into the other pieces that are the most important things shaping these women's lives. But it was the unexpected reading. It was the unexpected. It was that kind of contradiction that I never would have got to if I'd only relied on surveys, or if I'd only sort of followed the really kind of tidy narrative of science. So I think it's those kind of discoveries and those kinds of moments, and it doesn't mean you don't have to be accountable, and that you don't have to have a really, you still need to do good research, right? But it's not about foreclosing on the data. And it's, if you're acknowledging that all data is value laden, then it frees you up in a kind of way to say, okay, rather than going and saying, this is my theoretical model, I'm going to apply it to whatever narratives, whatever transcripts I have. I mean, that's a predetermined outcome, right, going in, what sort of theoretical lens you're going to feed it through. But if you remain open to what the data is saying, if you let go of the guarantees and you're more open to sort of the unexpected, then I think in research that is actually working with bodies and a diverse group of people, that you're going to get a more complex bit of work to kind of ground your project in, and that's the really important part. I think part of that is then, I've had a responsibility to kind of write journal articles, and I've done that, but we've also done some film work and some other ways of trying to art-based projects to step back a little bit from the interpretive authority of me translating women's experiences and letting their words come to the surface a bit more, their images or their kind of what they want to communicate, be presented with less of me in the way. Has been really important.
And I can see the kind of motivation for you to do that in the paper as well. I can see that coming through, that you're trying to do that, but it's trying to represent their way of speaking about themselves, using the names that you used. So just people who haven't read the paper, you use the boxing nicknames that they gave themselves, right? Which is great, but it's taking your motivation and putting it into what is an unperfect system, the academic paper, for what you're talking about. So I think that managing it by trying our hardest in their academic outputs and then presenting other ways of enabling people to look at themselves, as you said as well, I think that's really useful. I really like that idea of the maintaining the complexity and avoiding the simple telling. I've got to be slightly careful with this because you'll probably be asked to review the paper, but I've submitted a paper which is about this sort of thing within anti-violence projects, within boxing and combat sports more broadly, where people, this kid, usually a lad, comes to this boxing gym and all of a sudden becomes good. And obviously it's the boxing that's done it for the boxing coach, because all they see is boxing has made this kid better. They don't realize that the kid went from 14 to 18 while they were with them and made his first girlfriend, boyfriend, and, realized he had to concentrate at school and all the rest of it. And it's this neat story of boxing did this with no evidence, no data, other than I saw a lad who started boxing and now he's better, quote unquote. And that story that we see in our participants, that's fair enough. This is your world. You see the world how you make fit, but that, as scientists, we can't do that. And I think what you're telling there is that openness, that you remain open. And that's one thing that I've had a kind of problem with in work that I've seen, especially within masculinity studies, specifically published work, which has said, I've written a paper about this. I'll link that below, which has said this is about masculinity, and the data has said this is not about masculinity. The person's literally said, no, it's not about that, it's something else. And then they arrive roughshod over it. And that's what I have a real problem with, is this, now we're able to go in and do what we might call politically motivated or ideologically motivated research. That in the wrong hands has become something that I don't think is appropriate as what we would understand as good social science. As you said, you've confirmed what you're going to find, so it's no longer science. It's fine, you can tell that story if you want, but it's not science anymore. Have you got anything to add on to that before we move on?
No, I think you've summarized it really well, and there's we do, I think as scholars, we have spent too much time not revealing how we got into the results.
Yeah.
Right. That's one thing I think we don't do enough telling of the doing of research.
For sure. And not only that, the analysis, the journeys we've been on with our thinking. As I'm writing this, but one of the big motivations is that I've been working with a PhD student, and we've had an amazing relationship, and I've seen her development as we all do with young scholars. And and her development is reminded me of mine. I reminded of the ridiculous mistakes that I made when I was younger, and will make in the future, obviously, as well. But that process of being so adamant about something, and then being on this this journey, and we don't tell that journey within our papers. You know, this is what, and you know, this notion of it emerged from the data, and all of a sudden, lo and behold, but it happened through hard work and sweat and rethinking and asking a supervisor or asking a mentor or speaking to a friend, or that's the process, and that's scientific in and of itself. You know, that kind of iterative, systematic way of rethinking. We've done this on her work by weekly meetings where she's had an idea and we've go, okay, so show it to me, demonstrate me that in the data, and it's really helped. So I think we've got to really, and what I'm trying to do with this, and one of the reasons why we're talking about it, is I'm trying to get a good grasp of what that process is and looks like. So when I write about it, it's a bit more developed. So, I mean, just one more thing before we move on then. What did your process of that look like, you know, in terms of the practicalities? Because we're saying we haven't got the space to write it in papers. So tell us, what did, you know, you went in, you had some ideas, they changed to this, they changed to that, the data did this, but I know you can't describe it in the time we've got, but roughly how long did that sort of thing take, and where did your ideas come from, and where did they go to?
You know, they really...
It's a long time ago as well. Sorry.
Yeah. No, and I mean, the process is in some ways the same, right? Your questions, even you're asking in an interview, are already sort of being framed by an analysis, right? You're already asking particular questions. So I really, I always go back to sort of Patty Lather, who talks about it's the responsibility of the researcher to get in and out of the way of the data. And so I try to make it clear when I'm getting in the way. So this is what a participant said, and here's another reading I'm layering onto that, which is clearly sort of signaling this is me saying this as one possible interpretation of this, of what a participant said. But it's not necessarily the thing they were meaning with what they were communicating, right? But there are other readings, right? And so to get to that, so yeah, it's really about just interrupting that kind of clarity, but doing it in a way that you're signaling this is where I'm stepping in front. This is what I'm asking on top of what the transcript presented, and here's clearly what it's saying. And I thinking through, we did this art project, so at one point we had to change the canvas on the ring and the boxing gym, and so the coach was taking that off, and a boxer said to her, "Can I have a piece of that canvas to paint on?" And you know, it became this moment, and it's like, God, it's a canvas, right? We don't really think about boxing, thinking about that as a canvas and a space to create on, and of course it is. And that sort of spurred, you know, the canvas was cut into 80 pieces and stretched and framed, and this art project was born. And people, you know, painted and talked as a way to kind of communicate how boxing affected them. And we had, you know, a single mother who would paint something that would be different from someone else, because what boxing meant to them was about the way they could now face motherhood as a single mother in Toronto. There was other women who wanted to reflect on things that had nothing to do with boxing, around sort of the Trayvon Martin being killed going to get Skittles. And there's a woman who painted that, and she talked about her fear of her racial, you know, for her racialized children. So again, not the kinds of things when you're, you know, the kind of wideness of what people are going to talk about their experiences. And, you know, if you're trying to code that in the traditional way, right, and pull out very sort of coherent themes, that singular approach is not going to do it. But if you kind of let go of that and see this complexity as an opportunity to pull out different experiences, then you get an opportunity to grapple with issues that would otherwise be overlooked. So I just see it as an opportunity, but you don't get to approach it with the same kind of clear, like, here are the 6 steps for your data analysis. Just follow these, like plug it into this, and you'll get this clean output, right? So it takes kind of more time, and you have to be kind of willing to go where the research is taking you. And it might mean jigging up and reading in some new areas that you weren't planning on too. So it's that kind of work. And it's difficult, but I think you have to kind of just be led by your data a little bit. Treat that material as, that's what you're going to make a meal with that day. It's like if you bought groceries, rather than saying, this is what I'm cooking tonight. Right. And so this is actually what I have to work with.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Nice. And then, that process enables, that process when I'm thinking about you talking about that, and I know the work that goes into that, when we have a social science student doing a PhD or a master's or whatever, early career researcher, when they understand that depth of work and what that looks like and feels like and how draining it can be, that's the equivalent of the hard science researcher who goes into the lab at 6 to get the cultures ready, to do an experiment at 10, to let it sit and do its thing, and then take them out at 8 and do the analysis. And I try and instill that in the students that work with me, is that time at the bench, at the scientific bench, is what you're just describing. Long-term process, probably in the field with lots of hours, when you've got to be committed and you've got to be disciplined in the field, and then also committed and disciplined with your thinking and writing. It's so easy within our area, I think, to let yourself be lazy. What you're talking about is the opposite of laziness. It's the self-motivated to find something, and the process is long term, cyclical, frustrating, and all the rest of it. So I think that's something that I really wanted to get out to people as well, is to understand that work. And both of us have been doing this for over a decade, and it doesn't stop, does it? It doesn't get easier. It's not like oh, I've got my PhD now, whatever. It's oh, I now know my 6 steps. It's different every time. So just to kind of wrap up then, we'll start wrapping up. 2 things to kind of one thing, but it's got 2 elements to it, is the hardness of being in the field, the problems that we get, the situations. And when I think about this, I talk about emotional experiences I've had with people who have told me stuff and I've taken it home. I won't go into the details of that because it's your stuff that I'm more interested in. The first thing is, when we discussed this, the first thing that we had to talk about is what you could even talk about. So I think before we get into any stories, which maybe we can't even get into, could you explain to me on the video what you were trying to get across in that email about, you could probably tell me something offline maybe, but there's things that can't be told. And what are those things? What's the line that defines them, and how can we understand that?
Yeah, I think, doing the research and staying with the project for 14 years, working with different community partnerships, the challenges of a project that requires a lot of money to kind of feed it, right? To keep providing the supports that participants need around transit, food, that kind of stuff. Really, I always think, the stuff that I write about is really important, but there's a whole B side, right? That is really about, if you're going to do this work, here's the stuff you need to know, and you're never going to learn it in a methods course, right? But here's the challenges of, when you're working with somebody whose livelihood is tied to their boxing gym, and the kind of demands they have to keep that gym open versus someone like me who comes in and wants to work with these participants, but I have someplace else to go after. Yeah. The difficulties around participants who are some struggle with addiction, mental health, and I'll just sort of say this we have had to work with a threat assessor to deal with a situation that unfolded over several years that had incredible implications for some of the people involved in the project. And it was on a level fascinating to work with a threat assessor. I think that's an interesting career to think about. But even, when we moved gym locations, we ended up hiring a person to work the door, literally to stop people from coming in And it had these other great benefits, which we found out later, that participants felt like there was somebody like greeting them when they came in, and it helped them with their anxiety. So it had this amazing other thing, but it was really, we had a different intention with paying somebody after we moved gyms to stand at the door. But there were other reasons behind that I think would be important to share, because they were framed by the research and through the research, but there are sort of limitations of what I could say about that. But that was the real impact of every single time we run the program, thinking through those issues. So, but there's other things that I'm still learning. And to me, that's the amazing thing, is that I still fumble my way through some of this, you know. One of those examples we'd received money from the Public Health Agency of Canada, so federal grant, which is amazing if you think about that, to fund a boxing program that's going to work with women's health. And it's the first day of the class, and we're sitting around the gym, and we have all the research team there. So we're introducing these are the researchers, here's your coaches, and we pull out the consent forms, right? So all the participants are asked, and we've told everybody about this, but now is the time to sort of get their signatures and formalize this so we can move on with the research. And so all the other coaches leave, and it's just the research team in the gym with the participants, and they're reading through it, and one of the participants yells out, what name should I use? And I don't know, your government name, and they went, okay. And then they filled out the form. And then we're debriefing afterwards, we're having food, and the coaches are all there. And this same participant calls me over and says, is it okay if I bring a bottle and a soother to the gym? And I knew right then with that question, I was in over my head. I didn't know where the question was coming from, nor how to answer it. And so I called over, and this is important. Our program always has a social worker in the gym at the same time. And so I called over Joanne and said, this participant has a question, and she explained it. And Joanne then said, well, why do you want a soother and a blanket? And this woman said, well, I have multiple, I have a personality disorder, and one of my personalities is an infant. And Joe just said, no, like, she's not welcome here. And then the participant went, okay. So it was that simple. But that was beyond anything I had ever, thought to encounter. A similar situation like that came up in an interview, and this is at the end of a participant being with us for a long time. And a bit of an older participant for our program, in her 60s. And we've had several women in their 60s, which has been great to sort of, to see that the different sort of bodies we get in the gym. And the participant, at the end of the interview, it was a great interview, got lots of really great stuff, had a wonderful conversation. And the participant, I just said at the end, it was sort of a last question. So what was it like to be, an older person in the gym, like to be in your 60s and be surrounded by 20-year-olds hitting heavy bags? And she said, do you know anything about identity disorder? And I said, a little bit. And she goes, well, it's usually a 15-year-old boy who's on the bags. It's not me. And so I was like, oh, okay. And I thought, in that moment, do I ask a follow-up question? Who am I talking to right now? Am I talking to a 15-year-old boy or a 60-some-year-old woman? What does this mean for the research? It had a whole bunch of questions, and I didn't ask any follow-up questions. But I took that transcript and I took it to a therapist, and I said, and I explained to them what the situation was. And she said, you were invited to ask that question. Right. And to honor that in the class, there's a 15-year-old boy there in the class. Right. So, and it had me thinking, so when you do this research and reading about trauma, right, the essence of trauma is disassociation, right? And it's something that I had to really think and read about. And it's something that we all kind of disassociate for a moment, right? When you're driving and you don't remember making a left-hand turn, but you've already arrived, and you can't kind of recall with clarity how exactly you got there. So that kind of really happens to us all, but that all the scholarship says it's the essence of trauma. And yet there's no research ethics guiding, no course that's saying, okay, when you're working with people who experience trauma, this is a way to think through that. So, that has been having to figure out what that means, how to help a participant ground again, if they need to. But again, this is, and I've taken this question I work with a bunch of other academics that work with trauma, and I talk about this. And I think it's because it's body work too, that we're not kind of clinical in the same kind of way a lot of other services get delivered, that the kind of ways the communications are different, and the kind of things that, the kind of conversations you have in a boxing gym are different than you have anywhere else. So I found there wasn't anyone to have those conversations with. Now, how do I write that up? And that's what I'm, struggling with now is how do I bring that in the telling of the doing of research, that's the kind, if you're going to work in a population that's experienced trauma, that here's the kinds of things we need to be aware of. And why are we not having those conversations? So to me, those are the things that, and this was after doing it already for a decade, so I keep learning, which is the great thing about doing this work. But you have to be willing then to dive into that literature and to kind of keep exploring what you don't know and those kind of things that arise, and just follow them, trace them out.
Yeah. And it shows that, I've already kind of discussed the continuing learning that we go through with reading, but the continuing set of skills that we develop as researchers. One of the things, whenever we talk about your research, in the back of my mind is, I'm so glad that you're doing this and not me. and there's other people who say something similar in my work. I've done some, what I would think of as quite stupid things in my research. I'm not saying you're stupid, obviously, but I think I've done some pretty stupid stuff in my work. And I've been quite happy to do that. That's a risk and a set of things that I'm quite happy doing. There's other people who'd be like, well, that I can't get on board with that. And we kind of find our own kind of happy medium, hopefully. And this is why I wanted to talk to you about this, because there's stories that I can tell people about research and the challenges and how hard it can be. But that's from a very, very kind of singular perspective. And we can't teach all of these different things, because, as you say, they come out in the time in the field, and all you can really know is that the research will go wrong, whatever that means. It won't be what you expected, and there will be challenges. The severity or the difficulty of them and whether they can be tackled or not is what you figure out along the way. And I think that your stories help us kind of go, oh, okay, here's some stories. Here's a kind of an end that we could get to towards. Most people's research, I don't think, will do that. And I would always encourage young people young scholars to go in at the shallow end of research. I don't mean that in shallow in terms of the findings that you get, but you go in and you don't go straight into the sort of work you're doing. If someone does, fair play to them. But as you said, this is something that you've kind of built up to and still learning at this stage, with all the skills and all the knowledge and all the kind of personal experiences you've got. A 23-4-year-old person who's still figuring themselves out doing this work. I mean, I just don't know how I would be able to supervise that personally. I'm sure you'd have a better go than I would. And there's been certain times when I've been able to draw on my kind of challenging experiences and supervise projects that have had similar things to what I've dealt with. But it's really important to get that across to people, I think, to understand when we go into these kind of challenging research projects, working with people that have had such challenging lives, that there's only one way this is going to go, and it's not going to be easy. So, okay, I think, is there anything else, just before we kind of wrap up, is there anything else you want to kind of add on to that?
Just, briefly, I'll just say that it's really important to not go into this work and do it on your own. Like, I've talked to other researchers and other people who want, who are setting up a program and doing this, and then wanting to also collect data and be the social worker, be the, all these things. And I think this should only be done with a solid team of people to do it well. And so that would be my caution, just for people that think about this as something to do as a project. It's a kind of commitment that you have to kind of really sit with for a long time.
Yeah, and knowing your own limitations. You already said,
Mm-hmm.
Someone asked a question, you were straight to someone else who's qualified. And the kind of limitations that we have as researchers, if someone discloses something, as researchers, even if we're on our own, we have a duty of care to that person, but it is limited. You know, the way I kind of describe this to someone is, something goes wrong in an interview in various ways. Your job is to make sure that person's safe and they're not going to cause any harm to anyone else, and until that's passed. And then after that, it has to be deferred to a counsellor or someone who's qualified, because, you know, especially PhD students, you know, they want to help their participants. They're probably quite confident that they're reasonably good at helping, but they're not. You know, they're a PhD student unless they're doing previously trained in counselling. They have to understand the limits of what they can do. It's certainly a problem within, it has been a traditional problem within men academics. You know, someone comes to a problem, I'm going to solve that for you, and we just simply can't. And that's something that we have to be aware of. It's something that I'm very aware of, is a problem that I've had in the past, understanding our limitations. So I think that's a great kind of way to finish off that team, the team that you need to do that. Okay, great. So what I'll do is I'll link to the program in the notes beneath. I'll link to the paper that we've discussed, and I think I've remembered a couple of the names that you've mentioned in terms of other kind of people that you go to try and understand stuff, your own thinking. And I know one of them's referenced in the paper, so I'll link them in. But is there anyone else you just kind of want to say, these are the people that, if you want to understand this area, this sort of action research, ideological research, where people should go to?
Yeah, I mean, I would add on to that, and this isn't necessarily for the research side of it, but there's an amazing book called The Body Keeps the Score by Bessel van der Kolk, and it's an amazing way to think about, you know, bringing the body into this kind of work, but what you need to understand first around that.
Great. Okay, I'll link to that as well. Brilliant. Thanks very much, Cathy. Great to catch up. Great to see you. Hopefully, we'll get through this this latest lockdown and we'll be able to come and visit again. We're supposed to have been in Toronto last year for a wedding. It's been bumped, so we're still hopeful we might be able to come. So if we come, we'll come and say hi. So yeah, thanks very much for chatting. Really appreciate it, and I'll catch you soon. Sounds
good. Thanks. We'll have a pint.
We certainly will.
All right.
We'll probably have more than one pint, I expect. Okay, cheers.